Welcome to the European Parliament for this new edition of Talking Europe. Gathering here in Brussels, EU leaders focused on defence and security policies. The issue had long been overshadowed by the bloc's battle against the euro crisis. But the French-led interventions in Mali and the Central African Republic have revealed the lack of a common European defence policy. How can Europe boost its military capabilities and become a global player? That's the question I'll put to my panel of guests today. And in the second part of the show, I'll be joined by the Russian ambassador to the European Union. As Brussels and Moscow clash over the future of Ukraine, I'll ask him why Russia is pressuring its neighbour into entering a Eurasian customs union. Eleni, Koppa, welcome to Talking Europe. You're a Greek MEP from the Socialists and Democrats. You're the author of a parliamentary report on the future of European defence. Geoffrey van Orden, welcome to Talking Europe. You're a British MEP from the European Conservatives and Reformists. At home you belong to the Conservatives, the party of David Cameron. Will Europe have a common army in the future? A strong and modern army replacing the 28 national militaries, where we're still far from it. In the early 90s, a Belgian foreign minister of the time famously described Europe as an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military worm. Is this still true today?
It is unfortunately. And you know, the idea of a European army is not on the table. And I think it creates false impressions. What we need now and what common European security policy is about is the possibility to cooperate better, to coordinate our efforts in order to spend less in an era of economic crisis.
Do you agree, Geoffrey van Orden, that the best we can hope for at this stage is better coordination, better cooperation, but no European army?
I don't hope for a European army. I think this is a nonsensical dream of those that see a state called Europe. We don't want a state called Europe. We're opposed to the whole concept of ever closer union. So the idea that the European Union should create some military capability to rival, if not distract from, duties towards NATO, I find wholly unsupportable.
Now we have 28 armies that need to cooperate better, that need to cooperate. Because in any case, concerning relations of NATO, we are for a complementarity of the two organizations, for a strategic autonomy of each one of them at the decision-making level.
If I may say, this is complete nonsense. This is all to do with the idea of the European Union being a state-like actor on the world stage. Many people do not share that view. They don't want to see the European having that role. They want the European Union to focus on economic growth and jobs and things like that, not playing soldiers or playing diplomacy in this sort of way. We have an international alliance that works perfectly well. What we want to see is more commitment from all of our European allies in NATO and the willingness, the will, actually to do something.
Now, let's look at a few figures. Europe has more active troops than the US. 890,000 in Europe against, well, if you put all the European member states together, but it's still called Europe, I believe, against 600,000 in the United States. You're telling us that there is NATO and that we should feel comfortable within NATO. When you look at what happened in Libya, though, it was quite humiliating for Europe at the time because Britain and France wanted to go, and at the end of the day, they were obliged to let the US and NATO take the initiative. Doesn't this create a problem?
Because we don't have an operational headquarter. We don't have the capabilities we needed. That's, for example, air-to-air refueling was something that European did not have at that stage. So, concerning air-to-air refueling, we had to turn to NATO capabilities and to the United States. Europe has to build its own capabilities. NATO is an alliance, a military alliance, and it's not always welcome in places where EU can operate.
But then the United States is complaining that Europe isn't taking part in NATO, and as you know, in an increasingly multipolar world, the United States doesn't want to intervene anymore in Europe or on Europe's doorstep. So Europe needs to beef up its defence, I guess.
No, I'm sorry, this whole argument misleads people. From the beginning of NATO, right at the beginning of the Cold War, the United States, of course, wanted European allies to share more of the burden. This has been a constant struggle. They're not pulling their weight. And anyone that imagines that by creating some sort of European capability separate from NATO is going to somehow or other increase the willingness and capability of Europeans is totally deluded. NATO, by the way, is us. It's not them. It's not the Americans. NATO has 28 members, 22 of them are members of the European Union. You tell me, why on earth do we need to have coordination mechanisms in the same city of Brussels so that the representatives of one lot of European nations can talk to their own representatives in another place in the same city? This is nonsense.
I have an answer on that. For example, let's take one of the most successful military missions of EU, Operation Atalanta. It's an operation at the Corn of Africa against Somalia. There, if it was not EU and it was NATO, we could never have the support of independent countries like India or China. NATO is not always welcome. So, of course, it is us. But it concerns what umbrella, what hat we want to wear in each particular situation. This gives options to Europe. We don't have to choose one or the other. We must have both options on the table and use the best and depending on the situation.
The European Union ranges around to try and find justifications for its ambition. Its ambition is to have its own diplomacy and its own military capability for its own political ends. Nothing to do with creating more capability or anything like that.
Do you recognize the need for Europe to better coordinate its armies? Because, I mentioned the figures. Europe has more troops than the United States, but its armies on the whole are obsolete, they're ill-equipped. You need to avoid all these this duplication in equipment and overhead.
This is exactly what the European Union is doing, is duplicating capabilities which already exist in NATO. I'm very much in favour of the smaller European countries that don't have the most up-to-date deployable forces and interoperability. Those forces, if they can help one another to create more of a package of deployable military capability, that's all too well and good. The European Union doesn't need to be involved in this. And let's be clear, in Europe, who are the military powers? Actually, there are two. One is
your country and France.
One is the United Kingdom, and the other is France.
Oh, we can add to that Poland also, or Spain, that has also an aspiration in Italy to play a role.
Marilena, Koppa, where can you, because we understand that from a British perspective there's no need for a European army. You seem to believe, though, that Europe can help coordinate. Very concretely, what can Europe do?
What must Europe do in the future? Why not have an operational headquarter? For example, now we lead 30 missions all over the world, 70% civilian, 30% military. Why not have an operational headquarter to coordinate all European efforts all around the world? We can decide on our objectives, on our targets. We can pool and share, so avoid duplication, because I agree that we are the same nations that are part of NATO, in major part.
Exactly.
But CSDP gives more options. That's our position, and we don't know what will be the future of NATO. In 2014, we have a new review. After the end of Afghanistan, NATO searches a new narrative. We must continue to work also on CSDP and on Europe. The European project must have also a military security component.
You touch on an interesting point there, and that is most of these so-called CSDP, sort of military European Union missions, have been civilian. Precisely. Let the European Union concentrate on doing better with its civilian crisis management capabilities. Humanitarian aid, post-conflict reconstruction, all of these sorts of things. That would be complementary to NATO, and let's stop the EU playing soldiers for political purposes.
Okay, now moving to our next story. On the 5th of December, France deployed 1,600 troops in the Central African Republic. Since the crisis began a year ago, more than 700,000 people have been displaced inside the country. Many have died. But France says it needs support from its European partners. Let's watch our story.
For the first time in 5 years, the 28 European partners officially discussed a common defence policy. France is pushing for greater military cooperation. Paris is indeed counting on the deployment of European reinforcements in the Central African Republic. The Polish government is expected to confirm next week the deployment of 50 soldiers and a transport aircraft. Estonia and Belgium also said they would provide logistical and humanitarian support. Several units will assist with protecting civilians and training African troops. For the French president, it's a first step in the right direction.
We should be able to outline this European mission, the European operation, during the EU Foreign Affairs Council next January.
Germany stressed the importance of training and providing local armed forces on the ground with the right equipment. For the UK, though, a common defence policy should not supersede national military interests.
Defence issues, ultimately about war and peace and of a nation's armed forces, must be driven by nations themselves on a voluntary basis according to their own priorities and needs, not by some Brussels diktat about grand union ambitions.
All 28 EU members did agree on a common investment scheme to develop a European drone programme and communication satellites.
Marilena, Koppa, France unilaterally decided to deploy troops in the Central African Republic. It's now asking its European partners to help. Where was Europe?
We support, and I'm speaking as a member of the Socialist and Democrat group in the European Parliament, we support this operation. But it's unfortunate that France has not discussed with its European partners before intervening. To come afterwards, it's not good for the prospects of common security and defence policy. It's not an opposition on the substance, but on the way of acting.
We'll tell you it was a matter of an emergency, and if you had to discuss it, it would have taken months,
yes, but you
and
cannot,
the crisis would have developed.
I don't think
further.
it would have taken months. It's not a correct way of acting to present the European Union with a fait accompli. Of course, we can always, the European Union, according with Article 44 of the Lisbon Treaty, can always adopt, if I may say so, this operation, and I think it should do so.
Geoffrey Van Orden, Britain has offered logistical support, but no troops on the ground, as far as I understand.
Absolutely, as we did, by the way, in the Mali intervention. So France and the United Kingdom have a very good bilateral military relationship.
President Hollande would like to see more troops on the ground.
He's not going to get British troops on the ground there. We've borne the brunt of many operations over the last 20 years or so. The French have been there as well. But we, along with the Americans, have borne the brunt of these operations. And it's certainly not going to be a situation where we have British troops on the ground in any meaningful sense.
Okay, well, it's time to welcome our new partner in the program, European Voice, publisher of a weekly newspaper on EU news. Tim King will join us in a moment. European Voice provides independent insight into the Brussels Beltway. Here is Tim King. Welcome to Talking Europe. You'll look back at the week from a European perspective, from Brussels, and it's been a good week for...
I decided it's been a good week for ambitious central bankers, by which I mean those people working in the national banks of the member states, the things like the Bundesbank, the Banque de France and the Bank of England. And it's been a good week for one reason, because there's now a vacancy at the top table on the executive board of the European Central Bank, because Jörg Asmussen has been appointed to a job in the German government. And that creates a vacancy. And last time round, the big issue was that there were no women candidates, something that the European Parliament's Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee was very worked up about. So ambitious female central bankers might be wondering whether they can get a place on this top table of six
the deputy
men.
chair of the Bundesbank, I believe,
is one of the strong candidates for precisely that reason. Because at the moment the board is entirely male,
Absolutely.
and even the European Central Bank feels a bit guilty about that. We've also been looking at European Voice. We've been looking at all the salaries of the governors of all the national banks. It's a bit, I mean, the parallel with the military world that you were just talking about is that when you do start fusing the troops, how many generals are you left with, and are you paying them at the same salaries? And what we've been finding is that central bank governors seem to sort of carry on attracting enormous salaries.
So who is the best paid central banker?
The Belgians do very well. You may be surprised to learn, but there are just enormous disparities. The Portuguese central bank governor is paid more than the Spanish.
And it's been a bad week for...
Well, it's been a bad week for Spanish football clubs because they're getting into trouble over the tax arrangements that they have, and it's been a difficult time for the European Commissioner for Competition, Joaquin Almunia, who is known to be a supporter of one of these clubs. But anyway, he's supposed to have been investigating this, and the European Ombudsman, appointed by these MEPs here, she's been telling him, look, you've got to react more promptly when people complain about these tax arrangements. You need to come up with an explanation of what you're doing, and if you're not going to come up you're saying your investigation is still taking some time, you've got to explain where you've got to. So it's been a good week for her as well as a bad week for the clubs.
Thank you very much, Tim King. I remind our viewers that you are the editor of European Voice. What's on the front page of your newspaper this week?
Well, what we're dealing with really is the prospect of all these European commissioners who are going to lose their jobs at the end of next year, thinking about whether they can find a safe berth amongst the MEPs in the European Parliament.
I guess Viviane Reding might be one of them.
And there's speculation about Michel Barnier, and we're looking at them all.
Tim King, Marilena, Koppa, Geoffrey van Orden, thank you very much for taking part in this edition of Talking Europe. Please stay with me. I'll return just after the news break. I'll bring you an interview with the Russian ambassador to the European Union. We'll talk, of course, about the situation in Ukraine.